just wanted to start by saying we had a little conversation earlier, and these are the amazing things you get to do if you're president of an amazing place like CalArts. So I had a pre-existing relationship actually with the two of these folks, but I get to be in the presence of two of the. I get to moderate a discussion with two of the smartest people I know. So these are the moments that are really wonderful in your life. I wanted to start a little bit. I would start with you, Chad, and you've had an immersion in a very personal way with your home culture as well as with the different indigenous cultures and their concept and relationship with ecology. And I thought we'd start a little bit with that discussion, maybe as a primer into this space, and then see where the conversation takes us.
Okay, great. Well, Akhes Chaluk Petsia. Good evening, everyone. Good to be here with you. Indigenous peoples are the original ecologists. When we look at indigenous communities in the present day United States, we're talking about communities that have been rooted in a particular place for centuries, if not millennia. And so these communities have very intimate ties to their home communities, their ancestral homelands. And in the era of climate change, that is particularly valuable to all of us as human beings. And there are some things that we'll get into as we move the conversation forward. But, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has fairly recently determined that we would frankly be mad as a human race, a global community, to not solicit the input and the knowledge of our indigenous brothers and sisters. And so I'll talk a little bit about some specifics to my home community. But in general, what you find is that what you find in one indigenous community often has a very strong parallel in others. And in general terms, it's the way in which indigenous communities have and continue to view the world around them. And that is in a holistic fashion, recognizing the interconnectedness of all things. And in particular, paying close attention to how our actions not only impact us, maybe our families, maybe our communities, but also our non-human relatives. Everything with roots, legs, and wings, as we might say, and maybe gills too. Don't want to leave them out. So look forward to furthering the conversation, getting into some of these issues. Thank you very much.
So that's interesting, this concept of all of that being together and maybe not separated into a taxonomy from with it. That strikes me as something that's kind of an Enlightenment era practice that we find in the society in the United States a lot, in this kind of separation and kind of a mental analysis and separation, the philosophical proofs we all did, right, in college. I know you've thought deeply, Serene, about the Enlightenment beginnings and those theological manifestations of how that's happened in our country. And so I wonder if there are, what you think about this togetherness that is sort of an indigenous trait, if I'm hearing you correctly, Chad.
Well, first, thank you for that great question, and Chad, thank you for that great opening. And it's so important to talk about indigenous knowledge and indigenous communities as the original ecologists, because it's true that the sheer existence and persistence of communities over millennia that have been in a place and with a knowledge that has grown and deepened of that place is so rare and absolutely crucial to finding our way forward. And one of the things I'm always cognizant of, with many of the themes that we'll be talking about, but we can even begin with the notion of the radical interconnectedness of everything, is that one of the things that engaging in conversations and community with Indigenous communities can remind so many other religious and spiritual traditions. I can talk specifically about myself as a Christian, is that so many of these traditions that, in a sense, when we can talk about the Enlightenment and what that did to sort of cutting off that connection with nature, actually were, in their deep origins, religions of the land, and deeply tied to earth and profound sense of interconnectedness. And so I always find it wonderful the way in which these conversations can help remind other traditions of what they have lost in some ways, and how it opens up in these different spaces in different ways. I mean, all of us crawled out of the water and the land and have deep stories from the different lands that our ancestors inhabited about what was the significance of that. But so much of that has been obliterated and lost. And the necessity at this point in time for us to put our hands back in that soil and pull that water and bring those stories and traditions to life as they are in Indigenous practices and communities today.
Yeah, in some respects, I mean, this legacy of colonization has been the real disruptor, in the sense that you have folks colonizing places that aren't of their own, and you have a severing of that connection through that process, right? Vine Deloria talked a lot about that. He was a really important Native American thinker, philosopher, and historian.
We call him a theologian at Union.
Okay, sure, yeah, that's who.
We read him as a theologian in Ephesus, so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
What was that name?
Vine Deloria, Deloria Jr. Yeah, I'd recommend
God is Red.
God is Red. There you go. Yeah, that'd be good. That's a good one. Good starter.
I mean, that's one I would like.
Yeah.
I teach them. Yeah.
He talked about, I guess the irony is that when you look at present-day United States and first contact with Europeans, and the doctrine of discovery, which came from the church and basically provided the rationale to dispossess indigenous peoples of their ancestral lands here in North America, while they were in the process of displacing millions of indigenous peoples, they were also engaging in their own displacement with their ancestral lands in their home country. That's one of the reasons, we think that they were particularly dangerous to indigenous peoples. When you lose that connection, that rootedness to your own place, you're capable of some pretty awful things. Right?
And just so often when we, there's at so many different levels we can talk about the destructions of the colonial and conquering drive, but talking about the form that took in the Americas, it's very easy, I think, not very easy, it's very necessary and very common to think about colonialism and the displacement of indigenous people, and colonialism and the creation of this horrific entity called chattel slavery with its hundreds and hundreds of years of history. But what gets left out of that story is the displacement of native peoples was necessary in order to get the land. And chattel slavery was created in order to have the labor force to clear and exploit the land. And so the story of colonization is not just a story of and no, I don't mean to say just, it's not just a story of Native American genocide and the creation of chattel slavery. Those are both features of the primary goal, which was the extraction of wealth from land. So these are not three separate stories. Mm-hmm. These are all part of a single story that roots itself in the extraction of wealth from land. So eco-consciousness is deeply tied to our understanding of the history of colonization and of our understanding of indigenous displacement and of the whole creation of the categories of race in America. It was all about access to land and its exploitation, taking the wealth from it.
Ultimately, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, right?
Yeah.
That was the so-called manifest destiny.
The extraction
right?
of money from earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what would it take for us to, given I think the three of us accept at this point that there is a cleavage between those two things in terms of that the consciousness of the land and then the Enlightenment era, colonial era, however we want to characterize it, thinking that created this severance, right? How would we imagine a space in which that cleavage didn't exist?
Well, I guess I would say that I don't know if we have to imagine it necessarily. It happens with regularity in Native and Indigenous communities. So, my Spokane community, our oldest ceremony is known as the Winter Dance. And we hold it every February. It's 5 nights of dancing, singing, and praying in a longhouse, in our traditional longhouse. And our sacred foods are front and center. We will sit down and share those foods together. In our case, it includes roots, berries, salmon, simcleach, elk, and deer, and some other things. And these are the foods that have been our staple diet for millennia. But we're not just sitting down and sharing a meal. We actually sit down together on what we term the sacred floor in that longhouse and share those foods together. And getting back to this notion of holism, those foods are not separate from the songs. They're not separate from the prayers. Through that process, we continue to solidify and strengthen those bonds with these life-giving things, right, that are sacred to us. So, in terms of eco-consciousness and imagining what that might be, I would say this is, for me, kind of the central challenge. We've been conditioned and have grown accustomed to, through this process of colonization, to disregard and to ignore the indigenous peoples among us, right? Whether we're conscious of that or not, right? And so to become eco-conscious and eco-aware, we need to be aware of those subconscious components at play as well, and not kind of play into this ongoing process that continues to manifest itself in different ways. You notice I don't know how many NFL fans we have out here, but Washington Redskins finally gave up that name, which I gotta be honest with you, I didn't see that one coming, because that was Dan Snyder, I think is his name. I'm not a big NFL guy, but he was going to hold on to that. He was not going to give in to that. My point there, in getting back to this ongoing legacy of colonization. There are studies that have been done that clearly demonstrate that mascots, these native mascots, we still have the Cleveland Indians, right, and others, they lower the self-esteem of native kids. But conversely, they raise the self-esteem of non-native kids. It's all part of that process of conditioning. So, I don't want to dwell too much on of course, colonization and these things, but there's an important reckoning that really needs to happen, I think, before we can move on in a productive way. And so, getting back to eco-consciousness, and what I mentioned before, for instance, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recognizing that we have all this extraordinary indigenous knowledge built up over millennia in particular places. We're talking about communities that have had to adapt continually over thousands of years, right, in a particular environment. And so I guess I would again make the point that that knowledge is all around us. We just need to extend and broaden, I suppose, our hearing.
Maybe include some of that knowledge, some of that learning in our formation of of imagining a world where this cleavage was no longer there, this separation of the land, the concepts of the lands, and the other concepts that we have made to uphold our society, right?
Yeah, I have to just throw this in. I'm so proud of it, but the president of the Washington football team who pressed the name change is on the board of union.
Oh, wow.
And was the person who came in.
We need to hit pause on the recording device.
Yeah. I know he's very proud of it.
Okay.
His name is Jason Wright. And we were very interested to watch this process so closely, as he was the one pushing. First African American president of an NFL team. Of course, no accident there that those coincide, that he saw that. But that name changed, but we still have the Cowboys. So, and you realize how these realities are interconnected. So with the you can change the Washington name, but if you still have a category of the conqueror, it still implies that which is conquered.
Of course, it's not the Cracker Cowboys.
Yes.
It's not that derogatory element.
But what does it look like to begin to shift this? So, this is a small example, and I'm taking it from my own experience at Union. We have a center called the Center for Earth Ethics, where the support and expansion of eco-consciousness is the key to what happens in this center. And this last Earth Day, for the first time, we've done what many places in the world have done, and way too late, but we began to craft our land acknowledgement that begins every ceremony that we have. But we did it alongside our long-standing relationship with the Lenape-Hoking, which was it's controversial to try to say who were the original persons on the land where our school is, but the Lenape-Hoking is the group that we work the most closely with. And their request as we were working on this together, I shouldn't even say request because it was collaborative, was like, there needs to be the recognition of what contact and colonization did. But there also needs to be articulated a future in which indigenous knowledge is valued. So in our land acknowledgement, we acknowledge contact and conquest, but then we go on to say, and we look forward to continuing to create a future where the plants and the birds and the fish and the trees and then this is a wonderful line to say to a place like Union Scene, and all the beings, both seen and unseen, that are among us, we value them. And that statement has transformative impact on a historically Protestant seminary that wasn't used to saying things like that,
Yeah.
and that this begins, every ritual that we do now begins to give you a glimpse of what that does to the whole possibility of imagination. You're sitting in a chapel together and suddenly the beings unseen are with you. The ancestors are there. I just lift that up as a sort of the simultaneity of acknowledgement and of the future of the work of reshaping imagination.
Yeah. I really like that, and so it reminds me a bit of maybe a case study here in the potential of human transformation and coming into new ways of understanding the world around you. I focus my work a bit on the relationship between the Jesuits, go back to the first Jesuits, in the interior northwest United States. So Spokane tribe and many tribes occupy what's known as the Columbia Plateau region that encompasses parts of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, present day. And so when the Jesuits arrived, they were fairly innovative at the time. They had some success down in South America, in Paraguay, in putting Catholic hymns into indigenous languages as a way to convert those communities. In fact, it was the only thing, these hymns were the thing that actually made access possible. The indigenous communities were hearing these songs, these hymns, and going, what's that? I want to know more about that. So in any case, when they arrived in the Columbia Plateau in the 1840s, that was their playbook. So we're going to immediately start to translate these hymns into these indigenous languages. But in many other respects, as you might imagine, they sought to stifle every other form of traditional indigenous expression, in particular ceremonies and indigenous spirituality. But then came this Jesuit by the name of Father Tom Connolly, who started at the mission of Coeur d'Alene. This is in Idaho, present-day Idaho, in the 1950s. And before long, he befriended my great uncle, Gibson Eli, who was a Spokane medicine person. He's known as the last medicine man of the Spokane tribe. It's not entirely true. We still have medicine people, but he was the last real powerful medicine person that we had. And so they started spending some time together. Gib was in his 50s at the time. And, says, I think I want to become a Catholic. You do? Yeah, And his perspective was, what could be wrong with having more spiritual tools for the toolbox, right? But this priest by the name of Father Tom Connolly quickly became a student, if you will, of Gib Eli. He had a strong interest in these ceremonies. I mentioned the winter dance. Gib Eli invited him to come to winter dance. It's the first time since the 1840s that a Jesuit priest attended a winter dance, and this was in the 1960s. And boy, did he make a splash. He walks in, so you see these women shielding the eyes of their children. Don't look at the priest, something bad could happen. Okay. But Gib got up, he said, Father Tom Connolly's a friend. He's here to learn. And so he came into this period of basically reshaping his entire religious worldview. So our animal spirits, the unseen spirits that we continue to interact with today, unlike his predecessors who said they're clearly evil, we can't have you doing that, interacting with the animal spirits of all things. He equated them to angels. Right? And he attended these ceremonies and started having his own spiritual experiences. Beyond that, he started accompanying my great uncle to healings that he was performing on people. His specialties were arthritis and cancer. he would purge people of cancer in very dramatic ways. And that's the powerful piece I was talking about. So there you have a case where you get a sense of what's possible, right? In terms of someone dramatically shifting their perspective and their worldview. And it occurs to me as we're talking, this actually is a good example of the kind of thing we need to be doing fairly quickly. And that is expanding that worldview and dealing with the crisis before us. Right?
We need to do it like tonight.
Just getting started. Yeah.
So under your chair, no, just kidding. It does bring up the practical, which I've always been accused of bringing forth. The reality of it is that we have to find tools, I think, to imagine that space, right? And I think that exercises and communities and dialogues and things. I mean, it's a remarkable story, and I think the Jesuits had some tools to say, okay, this particular example, I'm going to immerse myself in that space and be ready, be open to changing my consciousness and learning.
Well, fortunately, none of this got back to Rome, so he kept his job.
He didn't change the Jesuits, but he kept, absolutely.
No internet.
But I wonder if either of you, or maybe this is a hybrid moment where people in the audience have some ideas about what are some ways what are some tools we could use to include these different consciousness that would help us imagine a space in which that severance is not there with the earth, with the ecology that is around us.
I think at a practical level, there's so much to say. So I had the pleasure of reading Chad's book, Songs of Power and Prayer in the Columbia Plateau. And I was struck in reading it about the importance in terms of changing consciousness, which is not just consciousness, it's like the whole reality of your body and your being. It's everything of your existence that needs to be transformed in eco-consciousness. But the importance of sound in that. We often think about images, how do we imagine beings unseen? What do they look like? We think mostly they look like. But do we ever think about what do they sound like? And how does our understanding of the sound of the interconnected world we live in shift as that eco-consciousness emerges? And I think sound is something you've thought a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting back to Gibson Eli, the first time that he received a song. So, in basic terms, we have what I've referred to as a process of song transmission from the spirit realm. It's something we've had for a long time. He was just a boy at the time, and he was out with his mom, and he was collecting roots. And he was collecting different types of roots. One required a lot of effort, a lot of work. You had to really dig deep to get these roots out. The other was more kind of on the surface. So he had a basket. And he focused on the ones that were on the surface because those are easier to get to, right? And he basically filled up most of the basket with those, and then he did the big digging, the deep digging, and just put a thin layer of that on the top. So he brought that back, and she didn't go for it. She looks at us and goes, "What are you doing? Get out there and do it right." But by then, it was dark. So he was really scared. He goes out, and he's doing the proper digging, and suddenly this animal appears and shares with him a song. And when that happens, what you're supposed to do is to take that song. Is that my wife? She's
Not the song again.
So when that happens, when you're given a song like that, it comes with certain responsibilities. And what it does is it connects you to that spiritual entity in a very profound way. You're basically, if you take that song on, you do have a choice. But if you agree to take that song on, you also need to abide by the rules that govern that song. And the reason for that is, with a song like that, and getting back to your point, the songs that come in that way, that are transmitted from the spirit realm, act as a catalyst for spiritual power and can be used to heal people. And so Gibson Eli would use those songs in the context of these healings I was talking about, that I talk about in the book. I'm not trying to plug the book.
But I am.
Thanks for reading.
This is
there aren't a lot of you. So, what that does, the song becomes this thing that basically is the connective tissue, if you will, between realms. Realm of the world that we occupy on a daily basis, in a conscious way, and then the spirit realm. And so, and then the ceremonies that we have, not just us, but indigenous communities everywhere. One parallel that you find is that these ceremonies, by design, thin the walls between those realms in the moment, in the context of those ceremonies. So, you have this ongoing reciprocal relationship between these realms. And that also applies more broadly to the type of reciprocity that indigenous communities value when it comes to our human and non-human relatives. Not taking more than you need, right? And ensuring, again, going back to this idea of kind of our broader responsibilities to other living things, thinking about how our actions impact those around us. And when I say those, I'm talking about our human families, but also our non-human relatives. So that's an example. Talking about these modes, the technology, if you will, right, to get at those unseen modes.
How strikingly different the thinking about not taking more than one needs, other than the general impetus of taking as much from the land as possible, which was the other stated goal that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Markedly different.
Yes.
In its impetus, right, in its thrust of what was motivating you. I've noticed that the examples that you've given have revolved around having a rite, R-I-T-E, the practices and the rituals, like about a meal and the symbols and everything, and this and this is again a practice of how that works.
Yeah.
That seems to be a tool that we could maybe. There are rituals, practices that we do on a daily basis.
Yeah.
That if we were to, those could be tools for how we could alter our consciousness, right? And if we think about this notion of, I always enjoy sharing table, I always enjoy not eating by myself and inviting people into that. But that is often to create human bonds, not necessarily to create bonds of the unseen, which it was in the example that you gave. So even in that moment, it's like, well, I have to broaden my own reasons for that. And so how would I do that? If I'm inviting people to eat with me, how would I find that to broaden that? And over time, that's going to change my consciousness. So even in that example, I've learned something, which is great. So those are, I think, some of the tools we can maybe take away from some of these.
Yeah.
Things.
And even getting back to the sacred foods, something as simple as giving a moment's thought to where the food comes from, what's given its life so you could eat, right? just taking that moment can really get that process moving in terms of shifting consciousness and broadening that awareness. Is that a...
Yeah, so let's...
okay.
Are there some questions
Okay.
from the audience that we that might engage our speakers here? Yes. I don't know, do we have a mic, or is it just speak loudly? I can repeat the question too.
Speak loudly.
Speak loudly, very good. Yeah, very good. I'll do both of those things. Go ahead.
So
It's got the voice for it.
when you brought up tools and you brought up the need to for people to listen, one thing that popped into my head is I was reading about the new constitution in Chile. It's being debated, and it's got a lot in there, and I don't know all of it. But one thing I read about was it has some legal mechanism for representation for indigenous people in the government, like part of Congress or a branch of government or something like that. Does America need constitutional change like that? Some kind of legal arm that would sort of force that kind of participation?
Deb Haaland will get it done.
Yeah.
Sadly, I think that there's some trouble passing that constitution. I believe it failed just now, but it was in the draft. These
But
things
do you
were
think that's a
present.
good idea, or what's your reaction to that concept? I'm just curious.
It's fascinating.
Wow. So,
The constitutional scholar we have now.
yeah. I mean, so Ravi and I both come from Oklahoma, and there's a really interesting constitutional reality unfolding there right now, which was the Supreme Court decision to return, it's called the McGirt decision, to return to the tribes all of the tribal lands that were never honored, the boundaries that were never honored in the original treaties. And what that has the possibility of allowing is it's extremely controversial as to how you actually do that when you have legal systems and, predominantly economic systems and habitation systems that are completely, dominating
And layered on top.
of each other. But if you were to ask the tribes in Oklahoma right now, they are pushing not to be brought into the world of state governance and federal governance, because they are just finally getting the chance to actually have self-governance. That matters, and it has enormous consequences for the capacity for Native persons to push back against unjust federal and state rules. So, for instance, the Choctaw have built some of the most progressive and state-of-the-art medical centers throughout their territories in Oklahoma now. They're open to everyone in Oklahoma. You don't have to be Choctaw to go and to use them. But they're debating right now whether or not, and I think they're moving towards deciding to do it, to make reproductive freedom possible in these clinics, because they're not governed by the state. They're not governed by the governor of Oklahoma, and they're not governed by the federal government. So that's an instance in which you say, why would you become part of the Constitution when in fact the most creative, resistant space you could be in was to actually be honored in that space that you of recognition of your original lands, which actually in Oklahoma is interesting because it wasn't Choctaw original land. Their original lands were back in Florida and South Carolina. It was originally Osage land, but these are just layers of questions that we have to sort through.
Where the Choctaw are now, but it's very interesting. I agree.
Yeah.
Growing up, there was some sovereignty to those nations, but over time, these nations have have said, well, if we have sovereignty, then this must be true. And the courts have upheld, you're correct, that must be true. Yeah. So I think that agency that the Indian nations have gained, and there is more and more sharing between nations. That's a new thing that's also happening between Indian nations, which have not always been happening. Is pretty remarkable, again, to go back and see those spaces of resistance, because, well, we have our own constitution. this land is governed by those rules, not that other one. We don't need to be included in that one. And so there's definitely that sentiment that's there.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that inclusion in this is going to be a priority, frankly, for many of the Indian nations. They're like, oh, we're just fine.
or just recognize what the treaties are that
Right.
have never been recognized, and return to us our lands and
Yeah.
let us govern them.
I think that would be the solution that would be proposed, is that rather than taking that layer, why don't we remove it? Which is a big thing, right?
Yeah, and in general terms, I mean, from a Native perspective, the relationship with the federal government is one of nation to nation, right? And, one thing that's interesting too, I mean, to kind of follow up on your point, is actually the courts in general have been fairly good historically in upholding treaty obligations and rights, thank goodness, because the states are routinely trying to claw those back. And so, I think the nation-to-nation idea is something that needs to be strengthened in and of itself, rather than a situation where Native nations become part of the existing federal government.
I mean, even at CalArts, so you wonder what a special assistant to the president means, but a big piece of what Chad...
It's senior advisor.
Oh, senior advisor, sorry. These interchangeable terms. The governmental relations is a big piece of what Chad and I spend a lot of time doing, because in the end, that sovereignty has to be recognized, right? So this is truly... It's not just that, we have a relationship with the U.S. government. Of course, we have federal student loans and those things. If we are going to have a relationship with these communities, it's through their rules, right? And how that happens, and sort of engaging that. And that's a structure that historically, when you think about government relations in higher education, it's U.S. government, of course. It's not your state government or maybe your local one, but not these nations who are sovereign nations. So that's an important addition, a layeral addition that changes even us as an institution to do it. So that's a shift in consciousness, to be able to think about those.
Me?
Yeah.
Awesome. In your community, Chad, musically, are there familiar keys or frequency that usher in the unseen? For example, in the African American church, the use of a Rhodes organ is often said to call in the Holy Spirit, with the Christians call the Holy Spirit. Is there a similar vibration, frequency, or key that is often used and familiar in ceremony?
In basic terms, no, not a specific.
Okay, so the question was, were there keys or frequencies? But it's fundamentally a key is notes, frequencies, pitches that are thought of in indigenous cultures to summon the unseen, but very specifically the divine unseen. I think you were talking about the Holy Spirit or that sort of space. The example was used in many black churches that the Fender Rhodes piano was something that's there. I think Fender Corp would be very happy that was there. But
it thins that line.
Yeah, right, exactly. But go ahead, Chad.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yes.
Two-part answer. In basic terms, no, not a specific key. We don't think of traditional songs in that sense. We don't kind of think of them in terms of a Western musical model. In fact, interesting point that I don't know of a Native American language that actually has a term for music per se. Song, in a traditional context, is really a prayer. It's a vehicle of prayer, and these things are equated. So that's kind of the general answer. But I've spent time with adherents of the seven drum religion in Nez Perce communities. So the Nez Perce, there's two historical bands, one up in the Wallowa Mountains in Oregon, and then eventually there was a reservation established in Idaho. And I've spent time in Idaho with those communities. True to the name, they have seven drummers who hit these drums when they sing. And that was the first time in a traditional Native context where I actually started thinking about frequency, because these drums unbelievably powerful, deafening in a sense, not in a way that does damage, but in terms of the frequencies, really, it's hard to imagine it doesn't play a role in opening that particular door and being a catalyst for that exchange between the singers, folks in attendance, and the spirit world.
So that's interesting. They know the drum to be that tool, but they don't necessarily go further and analyze of the frequencies of the complexity of that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to kind of make a big leap here, but a lot of the work that's going on in brain science has to do with understanding more about the effects of sounds on our brains. And there's a book that I teach on a course on trauma called The Body Keeps the Score. And one of the major points that is made in this book is all that now they know about the yoga Om and what happens to your body when you make that sound. That actually it has physiological effects on you. And that's just like one small piece, I think, that we're beginning to peel back about the sounds that you're describing. There is actual, cellular shifting happening when certain sounds at levels in the context of communities and practices, not just all by itself, but has on bodies and that thinning of that space.
Yeah, Brahma, the universe is sound. Right?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting.
This goes back to Hinduism.
Yeah. It just reminds me, my wife teaches Sunday school, right? And so the way she teaches the Lord's Prayer is actually through the chakras. And so the understanding of the Om is actually the lowest chakra, right? Yeah, exactly. And that being the base of that. But it is the only way she teaches the Lord's Prayer, which is funny, right?
Kind of like
raises some eyebrows, right? And
kind of like
depending on which
Jesuit
church.
up there and, bringing the Hinduism.
It's fascinating.
Collaboration.
Yeah. Carrie has a question.
Yeah, no, I mean, just about sound, I spent a lot of time with the Silver Cloud singers with the Lake Kevin Tarrant, and they would use a huge drum that, that was so powerful that it was, it's like your ability to think stopped. And it was like a way of opening to a different kind of consciousness, it was sort of interesting.
Right.
And it was also making me think a little bit about, the eco-artist Lauren Bond, in her metabolic studios, she's got these systems to sort of purify the water and take the kind of bacterial content out that are sound vibrations. So she's got this low-level drum. It's kind of like a 1 in a 5 sort of sound, and it's like it has a purifying purpose, but the actual feeling when you're there in the space is very transformative, and a lot of that is because of this sound that you're penetrated by all the time, and so just the idea of sound as being a way into these other ways of experiencing. I'm really glad that you brought that up.
That's why house music draws on gospel records, and that's why you're in a house club.
Yeah.
The bottom, the base of those comes from the church. That's why the relationship between
It's interesting because the lower frequencies are not directional by their nature, right? Higher frequencies, you point something there and you point it that way. Lower frequencies are felt, which is always interesting, right? Is that your ear can only hear certain things, but you want a bass amp that goes lower than where the ear can hear, right? Because you've got to feel it. Because when that jazz combo is playing, you feel the bass player. You don't necessarily hear the bass player, right? And so our instruments go lower and higher than human hearing, right? Because it still affects us, even though it's not orally derived, right? In the hearing. So it's fascinating, that the effect of, it's another tool of how we might expand our consciousness if we think about frequencies and sounds. And that is not only an expressive medium, but a communicative medium for us to be able to learn things. And it's fascinating.
I just wanted to, I think when you asked about tools earlier, my mind just went like reparations. It went right to reparations, right? But then to the sort of problem of the settler colonial mind around reparations, which is that it's a fantasy, right? That it's something impossible.
It's
right?
unfathomable, I think,
It's
also, right?
unfathomable.
Yes,
How
exactly.
can we go back? It wasn't us who did it. Right?
Exactly.
Here, Mitch McConnell says, it's not these generations. There's so many iterations, right, of that original settler colonial mindset, which is that I hold the keys to reality, right? And another reality that you might be discussing or imagining is not possible, right? And it's really interesting that we went to sound as a tool because of its ineffability, right? Like you're saying, it has to be felt.
Yes.
It is not very easy to explain, right? And it makes me think about this sort of this idea of opacity and the right to opacity. This is Edward Glissant, the Caribbean philosopher, talks about the colonized have a right to opacity, to not explain themselves to the colonizer, right? And so but I worry, how do you get the colonizing mind to think about something like reparations if you can't bring them into consciousness vibrations?
I don't think you can. I think that's the therein lies the problem, right? I mean, I don't know that it negates the right to opacity to want to. That right exists, right? But then that means it's the right of that person also to engage in this process using these tools. Also, there's no force in the manner. I think that's correct, right? There is a right to opacity in the way you described. That makes a lot of sense.
But I wonder if there is a way we can expand the definition of reparations, right? That we expand beyond sort of financial repayment, right? And is it grace, right? Can we understand reparations in that way? That and you don't have to be the original person who did it if that's the case, right? And if the thread between our ancestors to us right now, and then I can offer up grace, right? And then I think and try to repair my own self, right? If I'm the person who, or the ancestors in my bloodline. And I think
The unseen.
well, exactly. Yeah, exactly, the unseen. And I think it's I'm sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead, finish.
I think it's interesting because, and I'm listening to you and it's really fascinating, and I wonder, and I'm listening to you in the context of being an African American woman, right? And some of the traditions and things you talked about, I'm like, wait, that's familiar. Wait, I think James alluded to that, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that it shows up in my culture.
And they are for my Indian as well.
Yeah, I would imagine. And I think probably every person in here can say, wait, my grandmama did, or, or when I got sick, they went out into, I was born in the South, so they went to the garden to pick up, like, oh, you got a bug bite. Oh, go over there and get some nettle to put on your, So I think, so I think it's interesting, and it really is a place that I think we can be really. It gives me hope, and that's what this is all about, right?
Yeah.
And that's also the unseen, and believing that something good can come of this.
Yeah.
Because it is using and leveraging our imagination, and if you allow me to. Let me stand in my own culture, right? That I can respect yours, learn from it, right? And then also at the same time, by learning from you, it's not taking anything away from me. And that's repairing, right? So if people can sort of get that, they can realize the pie doesn't get smaller.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful.
And on that note, but before we go, we were going to do you were going to open Chad with a song and talking of sound, and also I thought you were talking about the land kind of
Give a closing blessing if you'd like to.
Closing blessing, and then and also we had talked a little bit about land acknowledgements and your feeling about land acknowledgements, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Small topic.
Just throw that in at the end there, maybe a little bit on
In the last 10 seconds we're here. Chad, talk about land acknowledgements and your feelings about that.
I'll just tell you how we're doing the land acknowledgement thing, or approaching that at Cal Arts. So the first peoples of the land where Cal Arts is are the Fernandinho and Tatavian Band of Mission Indians. And we actually don't have, at this point, an endorsed land acknowledgement that we're using at CalArts. The reason for that is increasingly Native communities have called BS on land acknowledgements because too often folks, they spend months, whatever, coming up with this land acknowledgement, whether or not they have indigenous tribal input, one case to another, you don't know, but it's just words, right? And so a lot of folks will say, well, we did this land acknowledgement, we do this, before our events, this, that, and the other thing. Good job, pat on the back. We've done what we need to do and moving on. In terms of how we're approaching it, we recognize the importance, as Serene was talking about in their approach too at Union, of having substantive relations with that tribal community and actually doing things that will benefit them. And so at CalArts we have this program, Community Arts Partnership, and they've been working with the Fernandino-Tatavian community now for I think about a year and a half. And they're offering programs. Basically, the Community Arts Partnership, what they do is they offer arts programming for students K through 12, generally 8th grade to 12th grade. But in the case of the Fernandino-Tatavian communities, it's K through 12. So they ran this pilot program the first year, actually the first summer, and it was so impactful that the Fernandino-Tatavian said, can we do this for this coming year? And we said, absolutely.
All year long, yeah.
Happy to do that. We're having culture bearers and leaders from the Fernandino-Tatavian come into campus on a regular basis to give our CalArts community a deeper sense of where they are. As Ravi said, this was last November, these are not our guests here today, folks. We're theirs. This is their land. This is their ancestral land. It's unceded, meaning they never gave it up in the first place. But fortunately for us, they're not there to take it back. Okay, with CalArts being there, you guys can do your thing. But those are just a couple of examples of the types of things that we're doing with those communities. We're having discussions about how we can bring some of their students to CalArts as CalArts students. That's really kind of the next phase here. We want to see that happens.
But this speaks to, Abigail, the difficulty of this work, doing this work. There was lots of pressure to do the land acknowledgement when I first came. And I was, in fact, called names by...
Gotta check that box.
Yeah, I was called names by people in the CalArts community because I was a resistant. I was the colonizing resistance. So apparently I was from the subcontinent. But it was pretty vociferous. I was in the way. I was doing this wrong. There were people who were not native leading that dialogue. And I was just like, I grew up in Oklahoma. I can tell you right now, the native nations that I know are not okay with this. So I can't be the leader that's okay with it. I can't be that. Yeah. And that's sort of, and then even then it's just like, well, you don't believe it because you didn't do it. I was like, okay, so because I didn't do the thing you're telling me. And how do you have that consciousness, right? So we go back to the consciousness. It's like, why would we not go to the Tataviam on whose land we're on and say, okay, what's the right way? You tell me.
What do we do? Yeah.
You tell me what's the right way to do this. Oh, well, we should start doing some things. We should have a space. Okay, let's start there, right? And then we can say, we have a relationship with this. This is where we're doing that, right? Then I feel it's okay because they have blessed us with that, right? And that's very important.
It does help when you sit down and share a cigar with the current president.
Tobacco has a role in these rituals. That's
where we started. A little embarrassing for me because I had lack of experience. But we got through it.
Yeah. But it's interesting at Union as we've gone through this similar process. There's many pieces to it, and that it includes out of the conversations and partnerships, the creation. From the Sweetwater Community Center in the Lobby-Hoking of a whole set of scholarships that are just there for Indigenous students to come to for nothing, for free. And it also includes regular unconstrained financial support for the Sweetwater Community Center, with which we have a partnership, and the creation of internships where there are constant community exchanges. So it wasn't just a single performance. But what's so interesting to me is for a seminary, the most profound part of it was the creation of a new ritual in which we were collectively saying things that were changing our imaginations.
We expanded the rite, as we were talking about before.
It changed the rite.
Yes.
And that is probably the single most long-standing effect of all of these things, is to have the community regularly saying, the plants and the fish and the trees and the birds and the beings seen and unseen. And that's more than a land acknowledgement. That is a echo consciousness shift.
Yeah.
And that's the work. So it's time to stop.
I think that's the right way to do
Carrie
it.
says over.
And so, Chad, we would be honored if you would bless us to conclude.
Okay, I'm going to share a song here. I talked about this process of transmission from the spirit realm. Oftentimes, this can happen in a vision scenario where someone has, we make a distinction between dreams and visions. Visions tend to have a level of clarity that dreams maybe don't often have. So they come to folks in that way. But songs also inhabit places within the landscape. And these tend to be sacred spaces or near sacred spaces. In the case of this song, this is a song that came to me that way. I have land in my Spokane ancestral territory, and the land is close to a place where our young people, historically, traditionally, would go and pray for a vision, fast for a vision. Maybe you've heard of vision quests like that. And this is a way of engaging the spirit, asking that the spirits bestow upon you something you can use for the benefit of the community. And oftentimes it is a song, in the way that my great uncle used songs to heal people and whatnot. So on this particular day, I'm fond of walking up this hillside right behind my property there. And that hillside looks down on our sacred river, Spokane River, in Quinaqua. And there are these prayer sites there that aren't utilized today, at least not currently, but were for many centuries. So I was ascending, this hillside, as I often did, and on that day, the winds just kicked up, very, very strong, almost violent. And if you had that experience where you're out somewhere and something happened, maybe it is a gust of wind, and you go, wow, that seemed like something more than a gust of wind. It raises your awareness, you go, wonder what's happening. So as I'm nearing the top, I'm going, wow, this just keeps getting more intense. There's big pine trees that are kind of swaying, I'm just taking all this in. Got to the top, and in the wind was that song. And in terms of this transmission process, this is where it's different than composition, if you will. These songs come fully formed. They're delivered. There's the song. It's finished in an instant, right? So this is the song I'll share with you. I refer to it as the Mi'kmaq song, the mountain song. Not quite a mountain, a hillside, but there's something about looking out at our sacred river and looking down on our sacred sites. The song has to do with that vision, that clarity of vision, being able to see a good distance and see before you what might be coming. And so I sing it for you today as a way for you to have some of that vision as it relates to your own life, to have that ability to see beyond what's right in front of you and have a sense of what's out there. Hey, hey, oh, oh, way, oh, hey, hey, oh, ho, way, oh, hey, 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 oh, way, oh, way, hey, hey, oh, away. Hey, hey, oh, oh, way, oh, way. Hey, hey, oh, oh, way, oh, way. Hey, hey, oh, way, oh, way. Hey, 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 oh, way.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you, Serene. What I tell you, two of the smartest people I know. Thank you for joining us this evening.